I hope you all are having a wonderful day. My name is Yupari, and I'd like to invite you into this still life painting demonstration. And we're going to change the pace a little bit with this still life painting video. So this is going to be dedicated to those of you that have never painted before or are very early in their stages in terms of painting. So that is those of you that have only painted a handful of times and really want a video that guides you through every step of the way in a kind of a paint along type fashion. So first, let me start off by listing my colors. So I have just titanium white, burnt umber, cadmium red medium, yellow ochre, sap green, cadmium green, ultramarine blue, and ivory black. And if you want to know exactly what materials I'll be using, you can go ahead and scroll down to the description box below. So to get started, I'm going to use just a piece of charcoal. And this could be any kind of charcoal, willow, vine charcoal, medium charcoal, but this just happens to be a little piece of Fusane, Nitrim Fusane charcoal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to establish the platform. So I'm going to say that the platform, let's say it's about here. And that's the first step to your painting. Just a little kind of platform line. The next step is going to be establishing where you want your still life object to be. So one mark here and another mark here. So we're kind of in the middle horizontally, but we're further down on the canvas vertically. So I think that's where I want the top to be, not entirely sure. But to get started, everyone knows this kind of shape, right? It's an oval type shape. Just letting my hand move around. And that's going to be how we indicate where we want the still life object to be placed. So the next step is going to be right here. Just indicate kind of the stem of the apple, and then using straight lines and angles, we're going to go ahead and block in this little ridge here. So that's going to be kind of the ridge of the apple, or whatever you call it really. It's just the top area of the apple. Now, straight lines and angles. Straight line here goes down here and into the bottom. Now, the apple is not a perfect circle. It does have some kind of planes. And if you've never heard of the word plane before, we're going to be using the word plane a lot when we get into kind of the smaller nuances within the apple. But essentially a plane is just kind of like this, a chop, just one little slice. Imagine it kind of like a slice on a brick or a slab of clay. So this is going to be kind of our rough shape for the apple. Remember, straight lines and angles. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we have, of course, this cast shadow. Now the light source is coming from this direction. So if you're setting up a still life at home similar to this one, you can go ahead and just set up a light kind of at this angle. Now what we're going to have is a cast shadow as a result on this side. Imagine the lights coming from here. Imagine kind of an angle like this. So I can actually use my ruler here. So imagine this is the angle where the light is coming from. There are actually multiple light sources on this apple just because of my studio lighting. So there's actually going to be another little shadow coming out in this direction, but nothing more complicated than this shape for the linear block in of the apple. Again, linear block in, we use the lines and straight lines and angles to block in the shape. Now the next thing you want to do is get just a regular old bristle brush. This is a size 4 Filbert bristle brush. I think it's just a Filbert. So we're going to go into our cadmium green and sap green together. No medium whatsoever, just paint. A little tiny bit of yellow ochre. So this is probably half and half sap green, cadmium green, and just a tiny bit of yellow ochre. And if you don't have cadmium green, it's quite all right. You could just use something like sap green and cadmium yellow if you have it. If not, just sap green and perhaps a little bit of titanium white would do just fine. So let's go ahead and establish the masses. So the masses refer to just these large areas of color and value. Now we're going to be applying a lot of emphasis on value, because value itself is really what gives the illusion of form most efficiently. So right about here, we're going to just fill in that shape now. Super simple. Not trying to make this complicated at all. You can paint this. If you've never painted before, this is it. This is how you can get into painting. All right, just a simple little shape there for the light. Now let's get into the shadow. Now with a different brush, I'm going to get into the ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, just ultramarine blue, yellow ochre. Kind of compare these colors next to one another on the palette. And by the way, for the painter's palette, I kind of like to have a neutral gray. So what this is just a sheet of replacement glass that I went ahead and just spray painted the back of it. Very inexpensive, but you could also use something like a wooden artist palette as well. I just like working on the glass. So now, remember this color combination, if you're trying to create this at home, no more complicated than ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. Just ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. And now we're going to put in this mass of shadow, not touching quite, but just filling this shape in. So that is the mass of the shadow, and there's actually kind of a bit of shadow right there, single brush mark right there. Now the next thing we want to do, get a separate brush, and this is a smaller brush, so I'm going to go into the burnt umber, ultramarine blue, just burnt umber ultramarine blue, and we're going to establish this darkest dark. Now this is going to be the accent. The accent's going to be, we're going to define it as the boundary of which one form meets another form. So that just means that the apple is meeting the platform, and thus this area right here is receiving the least amount of light, which is why it's so dark there. Now, the next thing I want to do is get a color for the platform. This color is actually pretty close to the platform color, but I still want it to be a little lighter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take yellow ochre, titanium white, just yellow ochre, titanium white. And by the way, this tone here on the canvas, you could work on a white canvas if you'd like, but I like toning my canvases prior to painting with burnt umber. So this color right here, the burnt umber, I just used a little bit of mineral spirits to dilute it and then toned this surface several weeks ago. So now, just using yellow ochre and the titanium white, we have established our color for the ground. Super simple. And we're leaving a little bit of space. Leave just a little bit of space in between the shapes. Super simple. Go ahead and fill it in even over here, because we're seeing just a little bit of it right there. And let's just let the tone of the burnt umber kind of serve as this kind of secondary shadow. Now normally I would recommend that you have just one light source. But this instance is a little different because I have multiple light sources. So tell you what this is just the same color that I had for the accent, ultramarine blue and burnt umber, and I'm just scumbling it onto here. So if you're working on a white canvas, those are the colors that you want to use. Super simple. Now, I want to get a tone for the background, so switching to a different brush. I know this technique does use quite a bit of brushes. Now you could use just 1 or 2 brushes if you'd like, but then you're going to have to clean the brushes periodically, which is not something that I wanted to do. So just ultramarine blue, ivory black, and a smidgen of cadmium red. Just a tiny bit of cadmium red. And if you're wondering why I'm using cadmium red, sometimes what I like to do is contrast complementary colors in a very subtle fashion. So basically, a tiny bit of red in the background will help to contrast with the green of the apple. This shape goes right into here. And again, this is super simple. If you've never painted before, you can paint this. And again, I'm not really letting it touch the surrounding shapes. Just filling this in. Ultramarine blue and ivory black. Now the reason I'm not using any medium is because I'm going to be building this painting in an alla prima type fashion, meaning I'm going to be painting wet on wet, and we'll get into that shortly. Alright, so now that we have this little tone filled in, let's go ahead and switch back to the apple. So with the same brush that I had before, I'm going to go ahead and mix up a halftone. So just using cadmium green, sap green, ultramarine blue, we have a halftone. So the halftone is essentially a change in value. So it is a change in value that is in between the light and the dark. And what we're doing is we're just putting in a flat plane. So this is our first real plane change in this picture. And it's alright if this edge touches the top a little bit. So that is our first plane change. Now what we're going to do is go back into the shadow tone. Ultramarine blue, sap green, a little bit of yellow ochre. See how this value is now a little bit darker? So this darker value is going to be kind of the next stage in the development of the shadow mass, meaning just the area of the shadow. So upon putting that halftone, I decided that I would make this area darker. Now then, with the same color, we're going to go ahead and back into this shape here because they are of the same family, meaning they're both shadow shapes. Switching brushes to a clean brush. This is just a clean synthetic brush. We're actually going to mix these shapes together. And this is going to be creating the terminator line and the dark light. So I'm throwing a lot of words at you all at once. So the dark light is what we're creating kind of by smudging these shapes together. And again, if you've never painted before, this is the technique to get you started. So basically, the dark light is going to be the darkest tone in the light, and it's going to help describe the curvature of the form the best. See how this is starting to look kind of like a round ball now? The terminator line is just basically the line delineating light from shadow. Next thing I'll do is get a fan brush and make it even more smooth. See that? See how I'm softening this edge with the fan brush? Super simple. Now then, the next thing I want to do is go back into the lights. And there's a very definitive color change here. This area, at least to me, appears to be a little bit more green. And we're also working our way up the value scale. So see how there's a little bit more green here. Now, if you're wondering about all the little nuances, the little details, and the little stripes and patterns that the apple has, we'll get to that, but we want to establish the large form first. This is very similar to portrait painting, at least in an alla prima fashion, meaning painting wet on wet like this. Back into the mid-tone. Here we're going to make this plane change now. So that plane is a little bit darker. And again, all I used was the halftone. Now I'm going to go back up on the value scale. It also helps to have a value scale such as this one on your palette. Remember, value just means how light or how dark something is. Now I'm going to take this and start to create the edge here. Remember, straight lines and angles. Straight line here, straight line around here. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that you're not trying to copy what you're looking at. I know it's tempting to think that, oh, okay, a realistic painter just looks at something and copies it. But not really. You kind of have to use a little bit of your own interpretation of nature. Now back to the background brush. I'm going to be, again, sculpting out that edge now. Now we're focused on this little edge. See how we're moving the brush? Back and forth, back and forth. Just trying to create that edge. I want this edge to be sharp, this edge to be soft, and then this edge here to be sharp again. This is a very sculptural way of working. Now with the fan brush, I'm just going to eliminate some glare. So remember, glare, just like with a picture frame, glare is just basically the oil paint reflecting light, and that's not something that I want right now. There we go. Now going back to the brush for the platform, remember that's just yellow ochre and titanium white. See how we're moving all around the picture? Titanium white, yellow ochre. Pushing really hard on there now. Pushing really hard into the canvas. And that's why I used a straight line, a straight edge here to get that shape. There we go. Now I'm actually going to go back to the other side. See how quickly we can create the illusion of form. Super simple. Now let's just go ahead and create this edge. Now I'm going to focus on primarily one light source, being this light source. So let's let these edges meet very carefully now. Now remember, if you've never painted before, this is one of the best ways to get started with oil painting. Now the next thing we want to do is with a different brush, let's start to create some of the lighter lights on the apple now. So cadmium green, titanium white, just cadmium green, titanium white. And now we're going to establish this lighter plane. Remember, a plane is just a chop, basically kind of a slice. Imagine it as a slice on a slab of clay. So it's very sculptural. And again, no medium at all, not using any medium. See how we're kind of feathering it out down here? Just feathering out the value. So we mixed the plane. Remember, we mixed this color, and then we soften the edge as we move down to this color. Now let's actually add a little more cadmium green, still with a lighter value. Lighten this shape right here. Now that's another plane change. Now this is a plane that's facing the light a little bit more. Now we're going to switch to a different brush with a little bit of burnt umber. So just burnt umber, yellow ochre, cadmium red. Let's go ahead and establish this little stem. See how we're building onto a kind of a three-dimensional structure. Now a little more yellow ochre. This should establish a light area on the apple, on the stem of the apple. Super simple. See, just light and shadow, and that's all you need for that to read. Now moving our way back down towards the accent, we're going to have to finalize this edge here. So basically just with a feather-like touch, just whispering the paint together, kind of just blending it together now, just to soften that edge. And now with the fan brush, just going to try to eliminate some glare. All right, so now the next thing to do is back to the brush that we put in this light mass with. Go back to the titanium white. See how we're moving up the value scale? A lot of titanium white now. Smidgen of cadmium green, just a little smidgen of cadmium green. A lot of titanium white. And now we're going to put in this little highlight. Simple little highlight. And the highlight is also a plane. Some folks refer to this as a specular reflection, meaning that it's an area that's directly reflecting the light source. Now, the next thing to do is to decide whether or not we want to put the secondary lights. See the little warm light here, warm light there. I think might as well. Let's go ahead and go into this color. So this is one thing you'll see me do a lot in my portrait painting videos. I'll just go into the colors right on the palette. And I think it needs to be a little lighter actually. So it's a little more titanium white. So that's basically titanium white, yellow ochre, and of course the cadmium green that was already on the brush. Super simple. These are all the many different light sources in my filming studio. There's one even over here. Now then, the details, the tiny little things to paint into the apple. So what I'm going to do is, with the same brush that I had the burnt umber, so this is the brush that I used for the stem, I'm going to just go ahead and mix into the mid-range of the palette. Mid-range meaning the middle in the tonality. Remember, tonality the tone just means how light or how dark something is. So sap green, ultramarine blue, just sap green, ultramarine blue, a little bit of cadmium green. Now there's going to be a few tiny little spots. See this? Tiny little spots that we're going to want to place on the apple. It's not a perfect apple. Nothing's perfect. The apple is going to have a few little spots. So we're going to go ahead, see this? Just kind of with very little pressure, applying very little pressure onto the apple, we're starting to place these spots. There's even some of it over here. Now, the one thing you must be cautious with is losing the differentiation between the light and the dark. And what I mean is that none of the lights in the dark should ever be anywhere near the values in the light range. And likewise, these darks that I'm placing in, the reason that they're in the mid-range is that I don't want any of these shapes to be confused with something in the shadow. Because what you're telling the viewer when you paint something as dark in the light as it is in the shadow is that either there's a hole in the apple, which is certainly possible, or that there's just something in here that isn't of the same dimension as the light plane. Long story short, just keep the lights in the light and the dark in the dark. So let's go ahead and just kind of adjust this edge now. Super simple. Now I see that there's still a little more dark that I can place in there. So let's go back into the shadow brush, ultramarine blue, sap green, just ultramarine blue, sap green. Let's test out this value. This looks pretty good. Just ultramarine blue, sap green. One important thing that I'm kind of omitting on purpose is actually the reflected light. So reflected light is basically light that's bouncing from here into the shadow. And I'm ignoring it because there's always a tendency to go too light in the reflected lights. So now I'm going into the mid-range with the shadow brush, and I'm going to go ahead and just re-establish this terminator line, but imagine this little peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys. See that? We're also creating a little bit of variation now in these spots. And then I'm going to go back to the fan brush and just use it to soften these little transitions. Adds a little bit of texture to the apple as well. Super simple. Now let's go ahead and just get a little bit of the ultramarine blue ivory black mixture that we had for the background. Add just a smidgen of cadmium red to it and finalize this accent, this dark accent. Very simple. It's the darkest dark in the picture. So that was pretty much just straight up ivory black at the end. So let's just use the fan brush. Try to eliminate some glare. Now going back in with the brush that we used for the platform, let's go ahead and just push this shape up a little bit, just so we don't have a floating apple, which actually sounds pretty cool if we just make the apple float. So the way to make something look like it's sitting on top of a surface is basically to pay attention to this accent. See how it's actually much smaller than I have it? So I'm going to go ahead and just push this up. Very simple. Next thing I'm going to do is go back into the background colors. So ivory black, ultramarine blue, a little bit of cadmium red. And I'm going to dilute the paint now with a little bit of odorless mineral spirits, tiny bit, and I'm going to dab the brush on paper towel. So this is going to help me fill in the rest of this background tone. So I'm just going to go ahead, just like this, just fill in the rest of this now with the background color. Now with another, this is actually a kind of a watercolor brush. You could also use any kind of synthetic, very, very thin brush. We're just going to go ahead and soften this transition even more. I just want this transition to be really, really soft. And again, to those of you that have never painted before, this is a very, very good way to get you acclimated into the nature of oil paint. So remember, we painted very, very thick in the beginning, not using any medium at all. And so what that does is it applies the application of very, very thick paint to begin with, it allows you to come back in with a very soft brush, such as this one, and just make the edges as soft as you want. Super soft. Incredibly soft. And at the same time, it's also creating a nice little gradation of tone. Now then, with the same brush, I noticed that I need to push this up. So let's just take it, move right across. See that? Moving right across the surface. It's helping us create another tone, but it's also helping us with this little edge here. Now just push down. Very simple. Just pushing this color down. And again, this was a clean synthetic watercolor brush. Very, very cheap brush. Now the largest difference that I'm noticing with my painting and the apple that I'm looking at is this is too green. So what I'm going to do is take a little bit. So here we're back to the mineral spirits and another little watercolor brush. Tiny bit of yellow ochre right into this light shape here. Notice how thick the paint is. Very, very thick. So a little bit of yellow ochre. So the paint is very thick on the palette, but notice how it's starting to thin out with the mineral spirits. And just using mineral spirits to thin it out. Not too much mineral spirits. I'd say about 2% mineral spirits. So what we're going to do is very lightly now, very lightly tap onto the surface. So what's happening is, as I mentioned earlier, when you're painting alla prima, meaning wet on wet, thin paint tends to stick onto thick paint. So what that means is that this extra little bit of, you can call it detail, is basically the layering of this yellow ochre type color onto the green. And I'm using a little bit of what's called as broken color. Now, broken color just means that you're dispersing one color on top of another with tiny little spots. See that? Tiny little spots. We're just putting tiny, tiny little spots. This is also very similar to a technique in traditional oil painting known as glazing. Very similar. But the difference is we're working wet on wet. Just very simply just tapping, getting this little bit of detail. And this is also kind of doing two things at once. One, it's giving us the little striations of the apple, if that's even a word. The little tiny I don't know what they are, like strands of color on the apple. And it's also helping to adjust the color as well. Now again, this is a very cheap watercolor brush. So one little tip with brushes, when I started off, I used all bristle brushes, but now with these smaller shapes, I'm only using synthetics to paint on top of the first layer. So first layer was very thick, using bristle brushes, and then this second little layer here, very thin, using synthetic brushes. And I think that I just want to leave the background shape to look somewhat like this, kind of like an abstract painting in the background. I'm just going to go ahead and eliminate that little shape of charcoal that was left behind. And so there you have it. That is hopefully a very simple to follow, kind of a paint along type of way of guiding you through an oil painting. So I hope that this video really helps you out. And to those of you that have never painted before, I really hope that you do give this technique a try. You can always set up an apple at home right in front of you with a single light source, and just like we ran through the simple shapes up until the final little touches. So I really hope that this video helps you out. I wish you the best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you on the next one.